with Royal Holloway doctoral student Sandra Lipner as part of the HGRP activities, explores one genre of personal documentation, private Holocaust-era correspondence, and we look at these as sites of knowledge production. So the exhibition is on show at the library for another week or so, and we'll soon launch a virtual version of this exhibition, which examines how Jewish persecutees understood and wrote about persecution as events unfolded around them and before the Holocaust was known as such. It explores how the different contexts in which they wrote shaped their knowledge and narratives and how that knowledge turned into action. We also closely examine the materiality of the correspondence and physical characteristics, including marginalia, markings, stamps, and textures that reveal their afterlives and help us to interpret the narratives contained within. The role of different generations of descendants and their embodied knowledge was key to their interpretation in the exhibition, and we worked with families to curate a section of the exhibition acknowledging their role in the creation and dissemination of new knowledge, some of which we could only access with their willingness and openness to work with us. So we are soon very much looking forward to sharing the virtual exhibition with wider audiences, and we hope that these two themes, even in a digital display, will be conveyed more broadly. The exhibition also marks a new partnership between the HGRP partners and the German Historical Institute and the California Institute of Technology, in which we will take up themes related to archives in and of transit in a soon-to-be-announced workshop, which we hope to host next year. So I wanted to especially thank Jennifer Rogers at Caltech and Sven Steinberg at the GHI Washington, who helped bring this group together. So today we will hear from our partners about their work in London and Washington, and we will of course have time at the end for some comments and questions. Before I introduce the two directors of the German Historical Institute, London and Washington, with us today, a few notes of housekeeping. We are recording this event, but your camera will not appear online. You will be kept on mute during the entire program, but if you have a comment or a question, please feel free to enter that into the chat at any time, and we will try to get to as many as possible. And if you have any technical difficulties, please just send me a direct message and I can try to help as best as possible. So I would like to now introduce the two directors of the German Historical Institute in Washington and London. We will hear first from Professor Simone Lessig, and later we will hear from Professor Christina von Hodenberg. Professor Simone Lessig is director of the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., and professor of modern history at Braunschweig University, and she is currently on leave. Her main fields of research are modern Jewish history, the history of knowledge and migration, digital history, and biography as a historical genre. Currently, she is working on a study of a transnational German Jewish banking family that focuses on gender and kinship from the early 19th century to the present, and a study on religion as an agent of change in German-speaking Central Europe, 1800 to 1860. We will also later hear from Professor Christina von Hodenberg, who is director of the German Historical Institute in London and a professor in European history at Queen Mary University of London. She has written 5 monographs in the fields of media history, social protest, and gender history. Her most recent book, a revisionist account of the late 1960s protest movements, is now forthcoming in English as The Other 1968, Social History of a Revolt from Oxford University Press. So without further ado, I would like to hand the virtual floor over to Professor Lessig.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. As the director of the German Historical Institute, I'm very pleased about this event, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speakers, Anna-Caroline Augustin and Indra Singh Gupta. I'm grateful to both of you, as well as to my two co-conveners, Christine Schmidt, the Deputy Director and Head of Research of the Wiener Library, and Christina von Hodenberg, the Director of the GHI London. This virtual exhibition panel is the result of a wonderful collaboration between our institutions and a great contribution to the In Global Transit International Standing Working Group that the GHI Washington founded and coordinates. The roots of this working group and the new research field it has been establishing reach back to a conference we jointly organized with the GHI London and its India branch office in New Delhi 5 years ago under the title In Global Transit, Jewish Migrants from Hitler's Europe in Asia, Africa, and Beyond. It was at this conference in Calcutta, India, and another conference we organized together a year later in Berkeley, California, that we realized the potential of transit, especially in its global dimension, as a topic for historical research. We felt, and meanwhile we know for sure, that this topic deserves much more empirical research, conceptual consideration, and scholarly exchange. Within the greater context of migration and refugee history, it does indeed call for exploration in its own right. Why? For many refugees, the phase between leaving the place they felt at home and settling down in a place they consider their new home, which means a place where they feel they can build a future for themselves and their families, is often very long. In most cases, it lasts much longer than they expected. Accordingly, our transit concept stands for this phase, for refugees being on the move and coping with uncertainties in and between different cultural, political, and geographical spaces. Many refugees find themselves in spaces they never intended to be, their long-term plans often disrupted or postponed indefinitely. In these phases, migrants leave behind most of what is familiar to them and encounter a great deal that is new. Much of their experience is so contingent that they find it difficult to develop trust in the future or even to plan for it. Nevertheless, challenged by completely new situations and unfamiliar actors, refugees develop new skills, competencies, and knowledge. Our standing working group is interested in asking questions about historical groups of refugees who experienced long phases of transit. How did they form both individual and collective coping strategies? How did they interact with those they depended on, as well as with racial and social others? How did they gain historical agency in doing so? Which artifacts did they produce in transit, and which of these might be valuable as primary sources for scholars who want to write to different histories of transit? We have discussed such questions in several workshops, panels, and publications, and we will also take them up at the workshop already mentioned, the workshop on archives of and archives in transit that we are currently planning collaboratively with a couple of distinguished partners, and Christine just mentioned them. Our working group has a website that fleshes out these ideas in far more detail, and we also have also been curating an academic blog closely related to the transit idea since 2018. Its contributions focus on migrant knowledge, that is not only the knowledge produced about and for migrants, but also and mainly the kinds of knowledge produced by them. And in addition, the panelists will certainly address the topic of transit in more detail. So I will leave it at that for now and introduce our panelists. Dr. Anna-Caroline Augustin, my dear colleague at the GHI Washington, will talk about Jewish ritual objects in transit, archives of knowledge, or vessels of memory, ? Anna-Caroline received her PhD in modern history from the University of Potsdam in 2016. After working for 2 years at the Jewish Museum Berlin, she published her first monograph, Berliner Kunstmatronage, Sammlerinnen und Förderinnen bildender Kunst um 1900 in 2018, and joined the GHI as a research fellow in 2019. Her main fields of interest are modern German Jewish history and culture, with an emphasis on women's and gender history, as well as Jewish material culture and provenance research in the field of Judaica. In her current research project, Anna merges her experiences as a trained museum professional and a scholar in a truly innovative way. She examines the entangled object biographies and migration paths of Jewish ceremonial objects, as well as their changing attributions of meaning and functions after 1945 in a transnational cultural historical study. And since 2021, she has been an active member of the small team that coordinates the transit group at the GHI Washington. Already 3 years earlier, in 2018, Dr. Indra Sengupta was part of another crucial team, namely the one that organized the above-mentioned first transit conference in Calcutta, a conference that would not have been possible without the expertise and the impressive, really impressive management skills Indra had developed. By bringing scholars together who had worked on the topic in a rather scattered manner, this event laid the foundation for a new and promising field in historical scholarship. And in her presentation, notes on the city as refuge, Jewish Calcutta and refugees from Hitler's Europe, Indra will reflect on the remarkable exhibition she co-curated in the context of this conference. Of course, I also want to provide a broader introduction to Indra beyond her role in helping to develop transit as a topic of historical research and in today's event. Indra Sengupta received her PhD from Heidelberg University and is both a senior research fellow and head of the India research program at the German Historical Institute, London. Until the end of 2020, she was also the head of the Max Weber Stiftung's India branch office in New Delhi. And her research interests include the production and practice of knowledge on India and colonial India and Europe, German Orientalism, and the practices of historical preservation in colonial India. Her more recent research projects focus on the production and circulation of local historical knowledge in the form of travel guides and local histories around sites of historical or cultural significance in India, and on law, bureaucracy, and historical conservation in India between 1904 and 1925. So there would, of course, be much more to say about our speakers, but I will stop here in order to leave enough time for Indra's and Anna Caroline's presentations with just one more observation. What a pleasure it is to note that nearly this entire panel, although co-organized by our dear male colleagues, Sven Steinberg, Dan Stone, and Toby Simpson, thank you all, that this panel is made up entirely of women. This is a rare constellation, to be sure. And so, ladies, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. So I will start away, right? Or were you supposed to start? No, I will start. Okay, sorry. Just a second. I will share my PowerPoint. Can you see it? Is it, yeah, working? Okay, perfect. So thanks again, Simone, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Christine Schmidt and Sven Steinberg and all the others involved in organizing this event.
Anna Caroline, this is on the presenter view. It's not the regular view.
Oh, okay. So I will change this setting. Is it now working?
Perfect. Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, again, in the next few minutes, I want to take a closer look at the post-World War II history of Jewish ritual objects, which I'm working on for my current research project at the GHI, as Simone has already mentioned. The history of these objects in Europe and the people and institutions associated with them is one marked by massive destruction, looting, displacement, as well as flight and migration. Against the backdrop of the Holocaust Letter exhibition at the Wiener Library, and even though I'm unfortunately not able to see it in person, but really looking forward to its virtual version. So against this backdrop, I thought it would be a good idea to ask to what extent Jewish ritual objects also maybe communicate knowledge or historical experience, and how this might be transformed in the context of global translocation. Allow me to begin with a short story. In April 2008, the New York Times reported on a special event in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day at the Central Synagogue in New York. The celebration was centered around an object, a Torah scroll, with a remarkable story. A Jewish community official of the synagogue in the Polish city of Auschwitz had hidden and buried the sacred scroll in a metal box before the Germans invaded the town. By chance, decades later, a man from Maryland, whom you can actually see on this slide, heard about the hidden Torah, went looking for it with a metal detector, and found it. Subsequently, he brought it to the United States, where it was first restored and later acquired by the New York Central Synagogue and rededicated for worship during the above-mentioned ceremony. The New York Times article called the Torah, quote, an extraordinary symbol of rebirth that gives meaning to Jewish survival and is a very concrete, tactile piece of remembrance, thus underscoring the extension of the object's meaning and status from being a Jewish ritual object to also being an important Holocaust memory object. Tragically, everything was a lie. In 2012, the man from Maryland was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud. 2 investigative journalists had revealed that the backstory of the scroll was fictional and the object itself a fake. This despicable fraud highlights the correlation of collective memory and the symbolic meaning, function, and status of an object, which can be fluid and sometimes even based on deception. However, it is not the question of authenticity or forgery that will be the focus of my brief presentation today, but the specific historical preconditions that formed the framework for this fraud: the Holocaust and the drastic destruction and looting and displacement of Jewish material culture during the course of it. The forger from Maryland played in a perfidious way with a problem that occurred after 1945. Displaced Jewish cultural assets, many of them being airless and anonymized by the Holocaust 1,000 times over, like, for instance, these Torah scrolls in Berlin, and the question of their future belonging, function, and meaning. To clarify, Jewish ritual objects are used to perform commanded religious acts. Torah scrolls, which have a unique sacred quality in Jewish rituals as they represent the centrality of the Hebrew Bible, are a prime example. However, over the centuries, a vast variety of decorative art objects related to dressing and embellishing the Torah with various textiles or precious metal objects were developed in different geographical regions. In addition to synagogal items, there are also a wide range of Jewish ritual objects used in Jewish homes, for instance, Hanukkah lamps. Because religious observance declined during the 19th century and the academic study of Judaism emerged, these objects that were formerly considered as purely religious were more and more framed in terms of their historical, cultural, and aesthetic values. This marked a major change, constituting the beginning of collecting, dealing, and studying Jewish ritual objects. It also spurred the establishment of Judaica collections, Jewish museums, and the academic field of Jewish art history. However, this development ended with the Holocaust. Jewish representatives of this emerging field of scholarship were murdered or expelled, so that their knowledge of the objects was lost or detached. Museum collections, synagogue inventories, and ritual objects from private homes were confiscated, looted, sold, destroyed, hidden, or transferred to exile by individual refugees or Jewish organizations. And this is actually a very rare example of a photograph documenting 2 men smuggling Judaica out of the war. Sometimes Jewish ritual objects taken along by Jewish refugees served as living mementos of family traditions. Already during their passage to exile to countries all over the world, thus being in transit, Jewish ritual objects often had a special bridging function, symbolizing the in-betweenness of emigration and immigration for Jewish refugees, as cultural historian Joachim Schlör has aptly pointed out. By using the objects in a new, unfamiliar setting, and we will maybe hear examples about colonial India by Indra later, Jewish refugees were able to actively remember their past while at the same time strengthen a feeling of Jewish belonging. In transit or exile, these objects were often carefully preserved and later inherited or given to close friends, like, for instance, the Sabbath lamp, which was carried with Dr. Isaac Kahn and his wife Johanna as they fled Nazi Germany, eventually resettling in Indonesia. Without heirs in Indonesia, the Kahns gave the lamp to a dear friend in Cincinnati to find a suitable home for it. This friend chose the Hebrew Union College, where many emigre scholars from Germany had found refuge as its new home. Today, it is hung in the college's sisterhood dormitory. Finding a new home was also a pressing task immediately after World War II, as thousands of Jewish ritual objects looted by the National Socialists were discovered by the Western Allies. What was to happen to these cultural treasures? Searching for, reclaiming, and identifying the surviving remnants of the European Jewish cultural heritage was a highly symbolic and contested process in the post-war era, thus adding a further layer of meaning to the objects in question, now symbolizing different ideas of Jewish survival and reconstruction, and hence the post-war future of Jewry. Most of the objects were declared heirless because European Jewish communities had largely been destroyed and the previous Jewish owners murdered. The US military government was the first of the Western Allies to address this problem by officially recognizing a Jewish restitution organization in February 1949, the so-called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, in short, JCR, and designating it to act as the trustee for heirless Jewish cultural property. The JCR was founded and run by prominent Jewish emigre intellectuals such as Hannah Arendt and Salo Baron. Until 1952, its field workers discovered, identified, evaluated, and distributed globally a large amount of Nazi-looted Jewish cultural objects. And you can see on this slide some of them stored in a so-called collecting point. Most objects were distributed to Jewish museum collections and synagogues in the US and Israel, but some, for instance, found their way to Canada, South Africa, Peru, and Argentina. These post-war allocations of heirless Jewish cultural objects principally aimed to preserve the memory of European Jewry and the Holocaust, and to promote the spiritual and cultural needs and interests of the Jewish people in general. The objects were thus regarded as vessels of memory and archives of knowledge. But were they? And to whom? Once the objects arrived at their destinations abroad, their recipients often had a sense of being overwhelmed by the toxic charge deriving from the murderous traumatic history. As is in the case of Guido Schönberger, a Jewish emigre art historian, curator, and Judaica expert who was processing the arrival of JCR objects in the US. Schönberger was originally from Frankfurt am Main, now living in New York, and a close confidant of Hannah Arendt for all questions regarding Jewish ritual objects. Schönberger devoted himself, like hardly anyone else, to the objects that were emotionally charged for him. In Schönberger's words, the objects, quote, were much more than just important pieces of a collection, and we handled them with a tender attachment of comrades. End of quote. It was refugees like Schönberger with special expertise and knowledge who were able to contextualize the globally displaced objects, preventing them from being totally disconnected from their previous contexts. He was able to give the objects back some of their history. By making use of his art historical training, he was sometimes able to determine their makers and whereabouts, as well as to which Jewish collection or community they had belonged before the war and what they had been used for. As an art historian, Schönberger also found that the object's value for art history enriched their memorial function. Thus, he made the promotion of Jewish art history in the US another one of his objectives. His numerous efforts to exhibit the surviving ritual objects from Europe not only in Jewish museums, but also in memorial spaces in American synagogues and Jewish community centers in rural parts of the country mirror this approach. This shaped the research interests of subsequent generations of art historians and Judaic experts and laid the foundation for Jewish art history becoming a legitimate branch of art history and Jewish studies at leading universities in the US. Jewish refugees' knowledge had a decisive effect, removing the displaced Jewish cultural heritage objects from anonymity. This applied also in other places. For instance, Harry Abt, who had fled from Germany to South Africa in 1939, also devoted a lifetime of service to the surviving remnants of ritual objects from Europe by organizing exhibitions and founding, together with his wife Friedel, the Jewish Museum in Johannesburg. Even though the objects now operated in a different cultural context and were geographically far removed from their original location, sometimes they did function as an archive for Jewish historians back in Europe. They would reach out to Harry Abt in South Africa, for instance, because they were interested in inscriptions on ceremonial objects, which give information about their age and also provide information about donors, genealogical and cultural historical information as well. Schönberger's and Abt's service for the study and appreciation of the objects, however, were not the rule, but exceptions. Most allocated pieces after the Holocaust were things without memory. This development tended to only intensify over time. Many of them lacked additional material or artistic value and remained in storage, like, for instance, here on this slide on the left side in the US and on the right side in Israel. This shows that an object's meaning is fragile and can certainly be contested if no further context or story can be told about them. The loss of the ritual object's meaning after the war is even more evident in relation to objects that were handed over to Jewish communities or in possession of private families. These objects were considered living items that were supposed to be used to rebuild and perpetuate Jewish cultural life and memory. Indeed, some of them were and still are in use, but congregations change and can die out completely. As a result, today it is almost impossible to trace where the JCR objects ended up. Occasionally, some appear on the art market. There's a similar case with family objects, as the knowledge of the object's former use, former owners, or other stories associated with them is often lost with new generations. An object's meaning, as we know, depends mostly on context and thus a transfer of knowledge. Knowledge about the objects is rarely an intrinsic property of things themselves, but it is rather the result of a multifaceted process in which people select, transform, and imprint meaning on objects and shape their status, especially in the case of Jewish ritual objects, whose previous owners and experts were largely murdered in the Holocaust. We are therefore dealing with a lot of ignorance today. For this very reason, the stories that often surround Jewish ritual objects must be taken with a grain of salt. All too often, they are shaped by false narratives of salvation, as in the case of the Auschwitz Torah scroll described at the beginning. Nevertheless, the rare cases in which objects themselves can tell their story should be taken into account by historians. Provenance research, which is the study of an object's history of ownership and treats objects as primary sources, provides helpful tools in this regard. In a way, its approach resembles archaeology. It investigates, for instance, traces on the object itself, such as inscriptions, stamps, labels, damages, or engraved numbers that help to reconstruct an object's biography. The result of this research can help to give the object a history again, to identify previous owners and maybe make restitution possible, but also to learn about experiences of transit and exile and about the structure of Nazi looting, as well as about early Holocaust research and post-war history. And I will leave it like that, and thank you very much.
Indra, do you want to continue?
Yes, I'll continue. Yes, just start my. So first of all, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers of this event, particularly Christine Schmidt, but also everyone else who's been involved with the process. Unlike Anna-Caroline, I am not an expert on Jewish history, nor am I an expert on object history. I have, however, had the pleasure, as Simone said in her earlier very kind introduction, I did have the pleasure of organizing an exhibition 5 years ago, which took place in relation and in the context of the conference we organized in global transit and Jewish migrants from Hitler's Europe, in Asia, Africa, and beyond. So this little paper is just to give you an idea of how we went about organizing the exhibition and what questions we asked and what were some and how did we try to sort of situate it in a particular urban space. The exhibition was not my work alone. I was helped in it, and many people worked on it, and I'm particularly grateful to Joseph Cronin from the Queen Mary University, Margaret Franz, Yael Silliman, a whole host of scholars who helped us along the way. But in particular, I'm very grateful to the descendants of many Jewish refugees who found themselves in India during in the period that we're talking about, in the interwar period, and particularly during the Second World War, who are now scattered all over the world, and they were kind enough to give us access to some of their private material. So as I said, we focused on a particular site, largely because the conference took place at the site, which was the city of Calcutta, but it was also because, along with Bombay, Calcutta was the second largest kind of site of, where Jewish refugees from Europe settled or lived in or transited through in the period of the war, just before the war, up until about the 50s or 60s. So the material that we came across included, things like letters, and of course that speaks to the theme of this conference, memoirs, websites that have since captured some of these experiences, scrapbooks, and I'll show you one example, photographs, of course, we know that. And so, but what is important, I think, if I may pick up on the point that Simone made also at the outset, which is what exactly is transiting and what is home, and how does the notion of home change? Because when you're in a place, you might come to a place, as many refugees from Europe did, thinking that this was going to be only for a couple of years. You don't know how long that is going to last. And similarly, when you are away, when you go back, I mean, there's always a sense of return, or what turned out to be repatriation. When you're in a new place, then how do you look back, and what is the value of the memory that you bring along, and how authentic is it? But I'm not really concerned. I don't have the competence to engage with these theoretical questions in any great detail. Nonetheless, I'll give you an idea of, these were some of the ways in which we thought about the exhibition and some of the questions that framed our work. Now, let me start with some boring stuff, which is really to give you a few statistics about what went on. Right, so around about, recent research has shown that there were about 5,000 refugees from Central Europe, not Germany alone, Germany and Austria in particular, but also other parts of Central Europe, who found shelter in India, shelter from Nazi persecution. And these numbers were, I mean, this is a substantially larger number than our previous research had revealed. And I have to say, this is a very, very problematic area for very many reasons related to document keeping and wartime archival record keeping. It's very difficult to get at exact numbers or anywhere near exact numbers. Nonetheless, Margaret Franz has undertaken an extremely detailed study of and an extremely in painstaking way she's put together these numbers, and it comes to around 5,000 in the period. Of course, there's a lot of fluctuation in that. Now, there were many groups amongst the people who were in India at the time, and scholars have identified roughly 3 groups that, and you can see them here on the slide. But for our purposes, it's really the refugees who are important, who were generally waiting to return home or be repatriated. And this becomes a major issue. And when they are repatriated, and that happens really after 1945, but particularly in the period 46 leading up to 47, 48, and it continues into the early 50s. And the return, of course, was facilitated in a very different way, but perhaps we can end with that. Why India? Why is that so important? India has been described by scholars as a kind of hardship exile for the refugees. But the interesting thing is that this didn't kind of happen overnight. A handful of refugees had pre-existing connections with India. Many of them were able to use existing networks, familial networks, friendship networks. Also the existence of the Jewish Refugee Association, which comes up later. But generally, India was regarded as a last resort, but a last resort along with Shanghai and other parts of, if you like, the non-European world. In India, there were, of course, host Jewish communities. There were, these were who had been in India for a very long time, were a part of India's history, the Bene Israel, the Cochin Jews, and in particular the Baghdadi Jews, who are particularly important for our story and for the way in which they were involved in organizing the relief and relief efforts from 1939 onwards. And these were very influential families, notably the Sassoons of Bombay or the Ezras of Calcutta, who were extremely influential both within India and also politically across to Britain. Now, there is, there's very little evidence of systematic evidence available of who these people were and what their qualifications were. Nonetheless, this kind of gives you a breakup of it's a very, very kind of a microscopic kind of screenshot evidence of one particular year, and it gives you an idea of of the kind of people who are here. In general, they were regarded as relatively highly educated. In particular, there were doctors and businessmen, and this created a lot of tension within Indian societies. But that's the subject of another talk. Now, refugee applications to come to India increased, of course, after 1938, in particular after the Anschluss and after Kristallnacht. But it wasn't a very easy passage, and there were all kinds of bureaucratic and political pressures that made this transit extremely difficult. And of course, once they arrived in India and once the war began, they were by and large declared enemy aliens and had to undergo long processes of internment. Because of course this included, and this is common knowledge, that they were forced to share lodgings with Nazi sympathizers, because basically anybody who was a German was a German first, and only much later could and did they prove that they had other claims to refuge and so on. And so as a result, really between 1939 and up until 1940 to 41, many of them had their status remained unclear, and they moved from internment camps, to what was known as parole centers. And and very often it went back and forth, so they could be sent back to internment, and then, but finally they were released as a result of, there were two commissions that worked on this, and finally between 1940 and 41, most of them were kind of released from internment. And why did they leave? I mean, generally, the leaving process is the high noon of the leaving process was 1945 to 1948. During this time, they mostly leave for the US, for Britain, for Australia, and then from 1948 onwards for Palestine and Israel. And of course, the reasons for departure are quite obvious: new destinations, better career opportunities, better climate, more cultural affinity with these destinations, reuniting with their relatives and families. A second reason was the political uncertainties in India following India's independence from colonial rule and the partition of the country, and this was kind of related to a third factor, which is that it became the colonial government made it extremely difficult for Jewish refugees to stay on in India, increasingly from the late 40s onwards. So that is roughly kind of the background, and this is what we explored. But the point is that in India, there are hardly any descendants. There's no cohort that we can deal with, that we know of, who are there, and they're scattered all over the world, which brings us really to the problem of locating sources and locating material. But as I said, there are lots and lots of initiatives, and people have been putting together these memoirs and life stories, etc. So this brings me really to the second part of my presentation, and I will really, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically I want to pick up three of what we did in the second part of the exhibition was to look at some of the lives, some of the people who, lived in India as refugees and what they did and how they lived their lives and so on. So the first of these was a gentleman called Alex Aronson, and he really belongs to a class of people who came to India not as a refugee, but became one as he was there. He came to see Rabindranath Tagore in Shantiniketan. He was inspired by the idea of Shantiniketan, and he lived there and he worked there. And in 1944, he emigrates to Israel. 1948, he emigrates to Israel and becomes an English teacher there. And you can see him in various roles. And I think one of the questions that might be legitimately asked is, how does your clothing, demeanor, comportment change in transit, and what that means? I will leave out what he did. He was basically an intellectual, and he lived in, but he remained quite kind of far removed from Indian culture, as it were. But what is important is this: he wrote a book called Brief Chronicles of the Time, and these are his personal recollections of his stay in India. And I find this very, very moving, but also very illuminating. And if you can, I don't need to read the entire text out aloud for you, but things like, from the very first moment I arrived there, I realized that I had left historical time behind, and that the calendar of political events had lost its significance, and so on and so forth. And then he talks about peace, and he talks about what, the feelings of relief of having left the nightmare of war behind. Okay, so that is Aronson. Then I have a second figure. Actually, it's a collective. I mean, it's a pair, but they were not a couple. This is Hans Glas, who was an architect, a Viennese trained architect, who goes to India in the 30s and finds work and finds employment, but also finds himself alone and he was very successful. He designs a lot of iconic buildings in India, but he doesn't really find, and he has friends, but he doesn't have a sense of belonging. Mind you, he stays on until the 1960s. Now, Hans Glas was very closely, a very close friend of his was Hilde Holger, the dancer. And Hilde Holger comes to India. He actually is instrumental in getting her over to India. Her entire family perish. And she comes to India and joins him. This is not a romantic relationship, but it's a very, very close relationship. Now, for Hilde Holger, there is a reason we didn't deal with her in much detail, but that is because she moved to Bombay and not to Calcutta, and became very big in the creative industries and so on. And she married in India, but then the family moved to England. And I'm very grateful to her daughter, Primavera Beaumont Bayram, who gave us access to a lot of their material. And she's put up this website called hildeholger.com. Hans Claus was an architect, and as I said, a very, very influential one, very important one. But again, we have a series of letters that he wrote to Hilde Holger. And one of these letters, which again I found very moving, reads like this. It's written at the end of 1938, and it's meant to persuade Hilde Holger to come and join him, leave Europe and flee the persecution and come to India. And he talks about his brothers and his family and so on, and how he's trying to get them over and so on. And he talks about how difficult it is, but nonetheless, we will then be 5. And this is a constant refrain. And then he says in the end, I love my brothers, it won't be easy, but we will manage. I'm convinced, dear Hilde, that you will feel comfortable when Indians are nice, they're charming. I've had the best of experiences with them. So there's a sense of hospitality, but no real sense of moorings here in Calcutta. And a final figure that I dealt with, and I was really struck by her because I was given a copy of the scrapbook that she had put together. And this is Liesl Starring. She was a pianist, a performer, and an extremely successful one. You have her dates here. She was born in she came to India in 1939 and stayed there until the 1960s and became a very, very successful radio performer, also, in films, Bombay films, and so on and so forth. And I was really drawn to the scrapbook. We have a digital copy of it, and here she is. She marries this man called Hans Handel, who is a doctor who is regarded as a spy, and there are masses of Home Office, of Home Department and Police Department files on him, on the changes of his status. But I found Liesl Starry particularly interesting, as I said, because of the scrapbook, where she actually details all her life here, and she was regarded as a child prodigy, prodigy, yes, and but again, she moves to India, has a career there, has a very, very big career, moves as a single, is interned during the war, meets her husband, is then discharged from internment, has this massive career, and goes on to become a big star. Moves to Britain in the 1950s, and in the early 60s, and becomes a big star there. So I'll leave you with some some images from her diary. And it's a meticulously kept diary and very beautifully illustrated from her childhood until when she comes to the United Kingdom. And with that, I'll leave you to, So basically, to conclude, all I would like to say is that this kind of exhibition, I mean, it can one sees what one can do with the material, however scarce, however scattered it is, how it can bring together, enable us to piece together this history. But more importantly, really, I think it is the importance and the role of these family archives and family members in keeping these memories alive. Now, as historians, we know what both the potential and problems of memory studies are. Nonetheless, how do we join together and piece together these kinds of evidences without the role of human experience and the memory of these? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indra, and also Anna Caroline for these insights. I want to just say a few words before we can enter a discussion, and please, everyone, if you have questions, if you have comments, do post them into the chat, and I'll be able to relate these then to our panelists. I just wanted to draw these presentations together by saying that everyone agrees on the significance of these letters and objects from periods of transit. The importance of working with families of survivors is certainly there in all the contexts that we have heard from. And it is important both to work with families to preserve objects, but also to preserve their meaning. And of course, the intergenerational transmission that comes in here means that there are differences in how well meaning translates to us as historians, and in how much we can actually invest, how much knowledge we can draw from these objects. And I think it makes a big difference whether we are dealing with letters, with photos, with scrapbooks, with religious objects, whether these objects come from a personal setting like the home, or whether they come from a religious setting like synagogues, whether they come from groups, defined groups, or whether they come from individuals. And I think these objects and letters can enable us to access different things. We can use them to talk about knowledge and skills that refugees acquired while they were in the difficult phase of transit and in limbo. But they can also enable us, if it works well, if it's like a well-documented object, to access emotional attachments, feelings of belonging, but also ways of intergenerational transmission of knowledge during and after the Holocaust. And I think the state of being in transit and this long phase of being in limbo for many refugees seems to have been a phase of that they found particularly testing, and where the limits of their belonging, of their emotional capabilities, of their networks, of their existing knowledge and how they could adapt it to the new circumstances were really being tested. And that, of course, was an intensely challenging phase for victims of persecution, but it can also be a phase that offers historians the opportunity of reconstructing very interesting lives and turning points in biographies, and also in the meanings of objects, and in the significance and the symbols attached to groups, so to group biographies, so to speak. But I also think we shouldn't overlook the silences and the limitations of the archive, of an archive of letters, of an archive of objects. We are working with a fraction of what existed back then, and there are big questions about who leaves their papers or their objects. Are there big differences in terms of gender and class? Do we mainly find educated, upper class refugees able to actually take some of these objects with them or leave them? Is it more men than women that pass their objects on? But also, what is the role of the experts that curate and collect and label these new archives, like this very interesting expert for Jewish ritual objects that you presented from America, Anna Caroline. So their decisions, the decisions of these past experts, but also of the families that hand down knowledge or don't, or that hand down particular narratives about the letters and the objects that they hand down to their sons and daughters, shape the archive that we are dealing with. And that is, of course, also something that we always have to keep in mind. And this goes even as far as the falsification of narratives attached to certain sources, where we have to be careful as well. Okay, that is all I wanted to say at this point. I think our panelists will have a chance to respond in a little bit, but I'll see what type of questions we have now in the chat so that we can maybe put a few questions to the panelists before I hand back to you. There's a question by Dan Stone for Anna Caroline, and it says, some scholars of objects seem to suggest that objects, especially religious objects from periods of atrocities such as the Holocaust, have agency, or that these objects are at least animate. And what do you think about that? Isabel Richter says that the speakers highlighted different media. So written culture, letters, diaries, or material culture. And she asks about the question of mediality. She wonders in what way mediality, so material culture, visual, written culture, shapes experiences and knowledge production, and whether different media open new windows to our notions of transit. Bob Olesh is asking, also I think this goes to Anna Caroline, why the Nazis didn't melt the metal ritual objects to further their war effort. And I think we leave it at that, and maybe I'll hand over to Anna Caroline first, if that's okay, to answer, a collection of questions that we have so far.
Sure, I'm happy to start. And I maybe will start with the last question you read out loud about the melting, because that is quite easily to answer, because actually the National Socialists melted quite a large amount of Jewish ritual objects. And that is also why the significance and meaning of the remnants that were existing after 45 was so high, because the number of objects was just so low after the war. Yeah, I would love to give you exact numbers, but of course that's not an easy task because of the Nazi documentation that has that is not fully accessible because so much was destroyed. But the numbers must have been high. And then to Isabel Richter's question about the materiality. So if you, for instance, compare the objects I'm dealing with, the ritual objects and letters that are center stage in the exhibitions, you can clearly see a huge difference in the knowledge they transmit, because of course letters are also objects in a way. They have a materiality, they have, and actually Christine mentioned it in her introduction, they have different script, different paper, different weight, and so on. So they clearly are objects, but of course they always also have a textual dimension, and that is much easier to access for us as historians than ritual objects that sometimes do have inscriptions, and I showed a few examples for that, but not always. And so you need actually quite a lot of expertise to read their history, and that makes it also, of course, a little exclusive. And Christina von Hohenberg, you mentioned the gender aspect, and I have to say it's actually a shame that I only mentioned men, because also women were, of course, very much involved after the war, especially because art history is such an field for women, and so their knowledge was also very important after the war. Yeah, but maybe I give Indra the floor.
Okay, over to you, Indra.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think since most of them were meant for Anna Caroline, it makes my job relatively simple. Nonetheless, I think I'll pick up the question on mediality that you, Isabel, spoke of. This is absolutely true. Now, of course, the problem that we faced was that it was extremely difficult to get at any kind of material things that were left behind. The advantage of letters, of course, is that they go back and forth. So not only are they material, they are grasp, in a way, also reproducible. You can, regardless of where you are, you can actually at least grasp the text, even if you can't hold the object in your hand. And that became quite important for us. And I think a lot of the stuff that people did in India and Calcutta was really quite text-based. I mean, there's a lot, they're extremely, articulate and very voluble and writing all the time, which of course speaks to Christina's questions about educated, levels of education and, whether it's educated people. I mean, this is kind of obvious, especially, given the kind of material we've looked at. These are, intellectuals, but also a lot of very creative people who are actually very big in the world of the arts. But to also pick up the question on families and, choices that families make when in the way in which they remember and how these archives are shaped. Now, there are two examples that, most of what I'm going to say is really from the experience of the exhibition. One was, I came across a case of a woman. So in colonial India, if you married a non-British national, you automatically lost your British nationality. And until that was changed a lot later. Now, what happened during the war was a number of, especially Baghdadi Jewish women, married some of these European Jewish refugees. And at that moment, they lost their British nationality. But of course, they couldn't acquire the nationality of their husband, because whether they were Polish or German, that was an impossibility in the time of the war. And there was one case of one woman who, there are lots of home department files on her, where she's constantly, she wants to go to Israel in 1948 to visit, not to stay. No, first she wants to go in 1946, she wants to visit the Palestine lands. She's denied a visa, and the visa is constantly denied on the basis that she doesn't have any nationality, that she can't be allowed, because she's not a British subject, therefore she can't be allowed to leave. Now, when I told this to her, the ancestors, her children still live here. They live locally, they live in Hampstead, St. John's Wood. When I contacted them, they're very kind enough to give me all the material, a lot of their material, but they denied this. And they said, this cannot be true because she did go. And I said, yes, she did go, but then the archives show that in 1948, she is then allowed to leave. But in the family narrative, of course, that this is, in a way, I came across as somebody who was trying to despoil the memory of their mother and her efforts. So there's a lot of emotional investment in the way in which not only the memories are kept alive, but the way in which the archival consistency is also kept alive, if you like. The second story is, this is Yael Silman. This is the person who helped us, and she has put together a massive collection of Jewish archives in India, and et cetera, et cetera. So she was at Simona knows the story because she was at our conference, and one of the questions, there was a panel on archives and memories and so on. And so one of the questions that she was faced with is, how do you, what kind of processes of academic rigor would you subject this kind of material to? Because, what's the provenance? How do you deal with all this? Or, authenticity and the usual archiving protocols. And she said, look, I'm creating a memory reservoir for a community that has left this country. And I don't care about archival protocols. And I thought that was really telling because, and she's a scholar, she's a feminist scholar, but she said this archive is to keep the memory of a community alive. And it has, so I don't really care. I just take whatever I get from whoever I get and I put it together. So, yeah.
Yes, I do think we're talking about two different functions of these letters and objects. We're talking about the function of that they are a repository of memory, reaching out to communities of descendants that are still alive and interested, and it doesn't have to be just descendants. There's like a public outreach purpose that can be fulfilled with these objects and letters. And I think the virtual exhibition and the exhibition that the Wiener Library has put together will definitely, I think, satisfy some of those cravings. And then on the other hand, there's of course also the function for generating new knowledge by historians and social scientists, which is also important. So we have two different functions. I think we all sidestepped Dan Stone's question about the agency of the objects a little bit, whether they are animate, whether they have agency. And I think we probably did, because we think that they do not have agency as such, but we're using them as tools to reconstruct the agency or the limits of agency of human actors at the time. This is how I interpret the silence in your answers. Let me know if that's wrong. We don't have any more questions at this point, and we have gone beyond the time. So I think I will thank our two speakers at this point, and I'll hand over to the director of the Wiener Library, Toby Simpson, for closing remarks.
Thank you. I have very much the most pleasant job of the evening, because my job is not to speak, but to thank and celebrate everything that's come before. So that's very much lucky for me. So I want to just say what a fascinating panel this has been. And it's especially a pleasure to have been able to sit here and listen to it, representing and coming from working at an institution like the library that in many ways, you know, was in transit for a very long time. Our current state of having a stable home was not the norm for the library. And and even now, little objects in transit still have an impact on us. The question of agency was really fascinating. One of many things that we've only just begun to sort of unravel here. And that's a good thing, because we don't see this as an end, but as very much as a beginning. And we've already alluded to the possibility of a future event in collaboration with the partners that have brought this evening together, which is something that we're very much looking forward to. So with that, I do just want to say a big thank you to all of the speakers this evening. Christine Schmidt from the Wiener Library, of course, Simona Lessig, Anna Karolin, Augustin, Indra Singupta, and Christina von Herdenberg. It's been a fascinating evening. And I'd also like to thank all of the guests and those who asked questions, but also those who, like me, sat and listened in fascination. So I'd like to thank everyone who's attended and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Good evening, everybody.